Rango, glories to Srila Prabhupada. Today we're continuing with the reading of Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita. We're on volume 3, chapter 1. Written by His Holiness Satsvarup Das Goswami. And if we have time, we have another book here today. This is written by Srila Prabhupada's, one of his secretaries, Shyam Sundar Das, who played a very prominent role in these early days in San Francisco, where he joined. So last week, we had read through an article that was written when Srila Prabhupada arrived in San Francisco at the airport, and the amazing reception that he received with Allen Ginsberg and a whole group, because just a few days before that, in the summer of, not the summer of love, there was a group on Hippie Hill of 20,000 hippies, and Allen Ginsberg had led for the first time amongst so many thousands and thousands of hippies the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra. And at that time, Allen Ginsberg had invited the hippies to come and greet Srila Prabhupada at the airport. So after Prabhupada arrived, there were newspaper articles, and there were also television announcements. And now we're on the second article that was written about Srila Prabhupada in the San Francisco Examiner, page 3. So Mukunda is reading this article to Srila Prabhupada, and the second part of the article is called Expounds. And Mukunda is reading, "The lanky master of faith," Mukunda read, "attired in a flowing ankle-long robe and sitting cross-legged on a big mattress." Swamiji interrupted. "What is this word lanky?" Mukunda explained that it meant tall and slender. "I don't know why they said that," he added. "Maybe it's because you sit so straight and tall, so they think that you are very tall." The article went on to describe many of the airport greeters as being of the long-haired, bearded, and sandaled set, meaning they were hippies. San Francisco's largest paper, the Chronicle, also ran an article, "Swami in Hippie Land, Holy Man Opens San Francisco Temple." The article began, "A holy man from India, described by his friend and beat poet Allen Ginsberg as one of the more conservative leaders of his faith, launched a kind of evangelistic effort yesterday in the heart of San Francisco's hippie haven." Srila Prabhupada objected to being called conservative. He was indignant. "Conservative? How is that?" "In respect to sex and drugs," Mukunda suggested. Now here we have a picture, because as soon as the devotees, as soon as Mukunda and Janaki and Sam and Melanie found a suitable storefront, they set up the Radha Krishna temple. And as soon as they could, they started the kirtans and the readings, and especially prasadam distribution. And it became so popular amongst the hippies who were all in that area. The house would be full. They would feed up to 200 people every day. And it didn't matter who it was. They all came in. They all got prasadam. So this is a little extra article. It was written by Shankarshan Prabhu, who lives here. He comes and goes. Some of his disciples are here, Shankarshan Prabhu. So he had written a Back to Godhead magazine article in the around that little afterwards. He had collected the things that Prabhupada said about hippies. There is a hill in San Francisco's Golden Gate Park, and we saw in the map last week, the Golden Gate Park and Hippie Hill was just walking distance from where the temple was. So this hill in Golden Gate Park that was so popular with the hippies that it was named Hippie Hill. Here are two pictures of Srila Prabhupada on Hippie Hill, engaged in the supreme welfare activity of pushing forward the Krishna consciousness movement. So Srila Prabhupada was so transcendental and ready to go anywhere to spread the chanting of Hare Krishna, that even he would go to Hippie Hill, he would sit down, and hundreds of young people would sit around him, just as at Tompkins Square Park, at Washington Square Park. They would sit around and chanting would go on for hours and hours. Srila Prabhupada turned the hippies into happies. So these are quotations from Prabhupada's letters. Actually, the hippies are our best customers. Almost all of our important disciples are recruited from that group. That was a letter to Gaur-Sundar, who also joined at this time, Gaur-Sundar and Govindadasi. They were artists, and they did a lot of service for Prabhupada. They also opened the Hawaii temple for Srila Prabhupada. Next letter, 1971. I want that all the hippies should come to me, and I shall solve their problems. Actually, all these hippies should join us. That was a letter to Satsvarup. And then in 1972, this is the best path, Krishna consciousness, because people are becoming happy. From hippies, they are becoming happies now. Therefore, it is the best path. They were confused, frustrated. Now they have got hopes in life. Thousands of boys and girls, they are admitting that you have given us a life. Ask any of the students, they will admit that is the best path. So Srila Prabhupada, he once asked Allen Ginsberg, that what is the meaning of hippie? So Allen Ginsberg, because he was quite world-traveled and also considered one of the leaders amongst the hippies, being a poet who could express their feelings, he said, actually, the original word comes from the opium dens, where people used to smoke opium and they would lie on their hips, and therefore they were called hippies. But now, the hippie generation, and especially at this time in America, it was the young people who were rejecting the political wars and the conformity and mainstream religions that taught that God is an old man looking down to see all of our sins, to send us to hell. They were rejecting all of these ideals, and they were trying to find a natural life full of peace and freedom. So that was what the hippies meant in the present day, although they did also take intoxication, many of them. So this is the, although they didn't have Radha and Krishna deities at that time, there were no deities yet installed. They named the temple not Matchless Gifts, but Radha Krishna Temple. Of course, we are conservative in that sense, Prabhupada said. That simply means we are following Shastra. We cannot depart from Bhagavad Gita, but conservative we are not. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was so strict that he would not even look on a woman, but we are accepting everyone into this movement, regardless of sex, caste, position, or whatever. Everyone is invited to come chant Hare Krishna. This is Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's munificence, his liberality. No, we are not conservative. And we heard that last week when the newspaper reporter was interviewing Prabhupada. And he asked Prabhupada, what is your message? And he said, I've come to give this Hare Krishna Maha Mantra for anyone, even for you. So no one is barred from chanting Hare Krishna. So now Prabhupada was in his apartment on the 3rd floor, just next to the temple. And Prabhupada, as soon as he arrived in San Francisco, he started his same daily schedule. And Prabhupada would do this everywhere around the world. Although Prabhupada traveled minimum 13 times around the world, and we know anyone who's been an international traveler, you have something called jet lag. Jet lag means you lose time as you either you gain time or you lose time. Sometimes when you're traveling, you can lose a whole day. You'll leave on the 11th and you arrive on the 13th, and the 12th just didn't exist. Or sometimes you'll leave on the 11th and you arrive on the 11th, earlier than when you left. Depends which direction you're going. So what Srila Prabhupada would do was, wherever he landed, whatever time it was, let's say he landed at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, no matter what time he left, he would pick up his daily schedule. 4 o'clock in the afternoon, he would have his fruit juice. So that way, although everyone else in his party would be suffering from jet lag, meaning trying to adjust the physical body into the time change, Prabhupada never allowed himself that convenience of jet lag. No, I have to sleep extra time because I missed a whole night of sleep. No, nothing like that. Anytime he landed, that was where he was, and he went on from there. So now, Prabhupada's just landed in San Francisco. From New York to San Francisco, there's a 3-hour time gap. You lose 3 hours or you gain 3 hours, depending upon which way you go. But Prabhupada, he didn't care. Srila Prabhupada rose from bed and turned on the light. It was 1 a.m. Although the alarm had not sounded, Prabhupada never had an alarm, and no one had come to wake him. He had risen on his own. The apartment was cold and quiet. Wrapping his chadar around his shoulders, he sat quietly at his makeshift desk, a trunk filled with manuscripts, and in deep concentration chanted the Hare Krishna mantra on his beads. Now of course, Prabhupada had his personal servants who lived with him. Usually they were either brahmacharis who were traveling with Prabhupada, or GBC men who would travel with Prabhupada, also as his secretaries. But he would always have a servant. For instance, Shruti was his servant for 2 years. Upendra was his servant. Nandakumar was his servant. Aravinda. He had particular servants that he had travel with him around the world. But while we were here in Vrindavan, before the temple was built, Prabhupada would actually sleep in his garden outside. His servant would set up his bed and put a net over it. His servant at that time was Shruti. And Prabhupada would sleep there in the garden. It was this time, hot time. It was actually July, August. And we, although Prabhupada didn't know it, were staying with the deities right in the room with just the windows separating us. And I would sleep by the window, and one night, 1 o'clock, Prabhupada woke up. And as I looked through the window, I saw, now we have to remember, what do we look like when we wake up in the morning? Miserable. First of all, we need an alarm clock. Who wakes up without an alarm clock? Oh, you're very advanced, just like Srila Prabhupada. Well, Srila Prabhupada, just 1 o'clock, he would go to sleep at 11, wake up at 1. And I saw from the window, when Prabhupada woke up, got out of his bed, he had the most beautiful smile on his face. looking up into the sky and smiling as he went into his room, because just from his bed, he would immediately go in, sit down at his desk, and start his dictation work. Wrapped in his chadar around his shoulders. So now at this point, Srila Prabhupada has come into where his desk is, and he's chanting japa. After an hour of chanting, Srila Prabhupada turned to his writing. Although 2 years had passed since he had published the book, the third and final volume of the first canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, he did all that publishing in India, he had daily been working, sometimes on his translation and commentary of the second canto, but mostly on Bhagavad Gita. In the 1940s in India, he had written an entire Bhagavad Gita translation and commentary, but his only copy had mysteriously disappeared. Now, we have been going through this Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita since 2022. We're in the third year now. And those of you who have been following through, you might remember that Srila Prabhupada had written, it was over 1,000 pages of the commentary to Bhagavad Gita. And he had asked one professor to do the editing, the English editing. And the professor gave his address, and Prabhupada mailed that entire manuscript to him, and that manuscript was lost. So now Srila Prabhupada was rewriting the entire manuscript with the word-for-word translations, just as we have the Bhagavad Gita now, and the purports to each of the slokas. Then in 1965, after a few months in America, he had begun again, starting with the introduction. Now, the introduction to the Bhagavad Gita, even that we have today, Prabhupada did not write that. Prabhupada gave a lecture, 3-hour lecture. And that 3-hour lecture, it was when he was at 72nd Street, living in the yoga studio of Dr. Mishra. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday in the evenings, he would have Bhagavad Gita classes for some of Dr. Mishra's students who were interested. Those lectures were combined together to make the introduction to the Bhagavad Gita that we now have in our Bhagavad Gita as it is, which he had composed in his room on 72nd Street in New York. Now thousands of manuscript pages filled his trunk, completing his Bhagavad Gita. If his New York disciple Hayagriva, formerly an English professor, could edit it, and if some of the other disciples could get it published, that would be an important achievement. So we will read later, and if you go down into Srila Prabhupada's rooms, when you go in, there's the front room, which is where we have the book table. That wasn't a room. That was a veranda, and it was empty. But when Srila Prabhupada became ill and was staying in his room and couldn't walk anymore, he was just lying on the big bed, they made that into a room so that a devotee guard could sit there and make sure people didn't come in to bother Srila Prabhupada. And then you go into the next room, and that's the secretary's room. And then the big room, and then to the left is the room where Srila Prabhupada would take prasadam, and there's a display cabinet there. Now in that display cabinet is a description of how the Bhagavad Gita actually got finally published. And we haven't yet come to that yet. We probably did. Srila Prabhupada had made the record album, the Happening album. And people were ordering that Happening album. And one of the accountants at the Macmillan Publishers Company ordered that record album. And Brahmananda told Prabhupada that, oh, someone from Macmillan has ordered it. And Prabhupada told Brahmananda, you go there and personally deliver the record to him. So when Brahmananda went there to deliver the record, it just turned out that he was one of the clerks who worked there. But when he went into the room, the head of the publishing department walked into the room. And the clerk introduced Brahmananda to this publisher. And Brahmananda he did exactly what Prabhupada told him to say. He said, I have a manuscript of the Bhagavad Gita. And the man said, you have the Bhagavad Gita? That's exactly what I've been looking for. Bring it and we'll print it. And that was how the Bhagavad Gita got printed. Now, Prabhupada's big Bhagavad Gita is over 1,000 pages printed. But they only wanted to print like 230 pages. So what Prabhupada had Hayagriva do was, he had him edit it down to 1/4 of the size. And that Bhagavad Gita was the first Bhagavad Gita that we had. It didn't have any of the Sanskrit in it. It only had the translations. And in the major slokas, we had partial purports because so much had to be cut out. Later, the original Bhagavad Gita manuscript was printed by Macmillan, and that sold more than any other Bhagavad Gita in the entire world. Millions and millions of copies, still selling now. But publishing books in America seemed difficult, more difficult than in India. Even though in India he had been alone, he had managed to publish 3 volumes in 3 years. Here in America, he had many followers, but many followers meant increased responsibilities. And none of his followers, as yet, seemed seriously inclined to take up typing, editing, and dealing with American businessmen. Now, we had heard that one student from Antioch College had come, he had gotten a work-study permit from the college to come and live with the devotees in New York. So he was typing, he could type 80 words a minute. He was typing Srila Prabhupada's manuscripts, pages and pages every day. But while Prabhupada was in San Francisco, his name was Neil. Neil had to go back to college. So Prabhupada wrote a letter to Satsarup that I've heard that Neil is gone now. So now I want to give you the task of typing my tapes, because Prabhupada was now dictating instead of typing himself. So he was sending Satsarup now. This is how Satsarup got his first permanent service. He was doing the transcriptions of Prabhupada's tapes for the Bhagavad Gita so it could get printed. Yet despite the dim prospects for publishing his Bhagavad Gita, Srila Prabhupada had begun translating another book, Chaitanya Charitamrita, the principal Vaishnava scripture on the life and teachings of Lord Chaitanya. So that also, Prabhupada was not typing that. We had heard that Srila Prabhupada had one evening brought down the big red book, which was Chaitanya Charitamrita. And he had started not with the Adi Leela. He had started with the Madhya Leela, chapter 20, the teachings to Sanatana Goswami, and then he went on to the teachings of Rupa Goswami and the teachings of Ramananda Roy. Prabhupada was concentrating on the philosophical teachings of Lord Chaitanya, at this point, rather than the entire Chaitanya Charitamrita, which Prabhupada would do later in 1974, and it would get printed in those days. It was 17 volumes, I forget how many, many volumes had to get printed. Now we only have it in 9 volumes because they're very thick. So these lectures that Prabhupada was giving, he gave about 20 lectures in New York, And then he continued with these lectures of teachings of Lord Chaitanya when he was in San Francisco. They were all compiled into this first book, Teachings of Lord Chaitanya. Putting on his reading glasses, Prabhupada opened his books and turned on the dictating machine. He studied the Bengali and Sanskrit texts, then picked up the microphone, flicked the switch to record, flashing on a small red light, and began speaking. While the Lord was going, chanting and dancing, he spoke no more than a phrase at a time, flicking the switch, pausing, and then dictating again. Thousands of people were following him, and some of them were laughing, some were dancing, and some singing. Some of them were falling on the ground, offering obeisances to the Lord. So if you go into Prabhupada's house again, in Prabhupada's main room, the Murti is sitting at his desk, Srila Prabhupada's Murti. Now that Murti, they have a bead bag on Prabhupada's hand, but actually that Murti is a dictating Murti, because it's at that desk where Srila Prabhupada would do his dictating. So in 1979, that was the first Murti that we got. And every day we would, at the times when Prabhupada would do his dictating, we had the dictating, because the machine would go under Prabhupada's desk, and we would put the microphone into Prabhupada's hand, and we would turn on tapes of Prabhupada's dictating. Because when Prabhupada first disappeared, we followed through all of the daily schedule that Srila Prabhupada did every day. When he ate, we would set up his table. When he had his massage, we would put out his massage. When he dictated, we would put the dictation on like that. So his hands actually, now what happened was, you'll see that also in Prabhupada's house, we now have a glass fence, right? That's because things started disappearing. People started taking souvenirs from Srila Prabhupada's house. And they would offer their obeisances, lying down flat, and whatever was under Prabhupada's table would disappear. They would go so far as they would offer their obeisances at Prabhupada's bed and chip off pieces of wood from his bed. That's how outrageous it became. So then we had to put that glass barrier. So now only the devotees, actually the devotees were the ones who were taking the souvenirs. So we had the dictating machine under Prabhupada's desk, and when these things started happening, for instance, the small Ashtadhatu kartals that were played by the devotees when Srila Prabhupada was sick, because we couldn't use the big kartals. Tiny little kartals, just this big. They disappeared one day. Yes. Prabhupada's tilak, gone. So one thing after the other. So then we had to build all the display cases, and that's why you can see the dictating machine, the Grundig, that Prabhupada carried all over the world, but you won't find it under his desk anymore, nor will you find his microphone, because we locked that up before that got stolen. His pen got stolen, but we didn't let the microphone get stolen. So now you can see them locked up in the display cases. Speaking and pausing, clicking the switch on and off, he would sit straight, sometimes gently rocking and nodding his head as he urged forward his words. Or he would bend low over his books, carefully studying them through his reading glasses. An hour passed, and Prabhupada worked on. The building was dark except for Prabhupada's lamp, and quiet except for the sound of his voice and the click and hum of the dictating machine. He wore a faded peach turtleneck jersey beneath his gray wool chadar. And since he had just risen from bed, his saffron dhoti was wrinkled. Srila Prabhupada, originally when his health was good, when he lived here in India, he would do as all sannyasis do, he would take 3 baths a day, cold water. But then after Prabhupada went to America and he had his stroke, he was advised not to take 3 cold baths every day. So he would just take 1 bath. He would take massage at, let's say, 11 o'clock. And then he would take his bath, and we would make 1 bucket of hot water, 1 bucket of cold water, and Prabhupada would mix the water so that it would be tepid because of his blood pressure. And then after that, he would take his lunch at 1 o'clock. So normally, Prabhupada would take an morning bath, and then noon bath, and then afternoon, like that. But now at this time, Prabhupada wasn't taking 3 baths anymore because of the heart attacks on the boat. Without having washed his face or gone to the bathroom, he sat absorbed in his work. At least for these few rare hours, the street and the Radha Krishna temple were quiet. This situation, with the night dark, the surroundings quiet, and him at his transcendental literary work, was not much different from his early morning hours in his room at the Radha Damodar temple in Vrindavan, India. And that's because Prabhupada followed his same schedule wherever he was, anywhere in the world. There, of course, in Vrindavan, he had no dictating machine, but he had worked during the same hours and from the same text, Chaitanya Charitamrita. Now, Srila Prabhupada began his Back to Godhead magazines in 1944, and he would study the newspapers and find out what the current events were, and he would write essays from a Vaishnava perspective on what was going on in the world. Aside from that, Srila Prabhupada began his translation work at that time. He was translating Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, Chaitanya Charitamrita, the prayers by King Kulashekar, prayers by Queen Kunti, the Bhagavad Gita. All of these translations, Srila Prabhupada would include in his Back to Godhead magazines, either with the original slokas and the word-for-word translations, or summary studies. So, for instance, this Back to Godhead, this is 1960. He has written an article here from the Chaitanya Charitamrita on the front page, and is called The Identity of Lord Chaitanya. Once he had begun a verse-by-verse translation with commentary, and another time he had written essays on the text of Chaitanya Charitamrita. Now, having just arrived in this corner of the world, so remote from the scenes of Lord Chaitanya's pastimes, he was beginning the first chapter of a new English version of Chaitanya Charitamrita. He called it Teachings of Lord Chaitanya. He was following what had become a vital routine in his life, rising early and writing the parampara message of Krishna consciousness, putting aside all other considerations, disregarding present circumstances. He would merge into the timeless message of transcendental knowledge. This was his most important service to Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati. The thought of producing more books and distributing them widely inspired him to rise every night and translate. Prabhupada worked until dawn. Then he stopped and prepared himself to go down to the temple for the morning meeting. So here, because, of course, Srila Prabhupada, he had a small room there in New York. He had a room in San Francisco. Here, when Prabhupada's house was built, he would translate at his desk, and then at night, after giving Bhagavad Gita class in the temple, he would go upstairs to, if you see this door right here, this door goes to the veranda of Prabhupada's upstairs. And upstairs, a room was built for Prabhupada. So that room would have Prabhupada's bed. We have an inside bed when the weather is not so nice. And we had an outside bed where Prabhupada preferred to sleep with the fresh air. And mosquito nets on both of the beds, depending upon where Prabhupada wanted to sleep. He would only sleep for 2 hours. Then, 9 o'clock, Prabhupada would take his nighttime meal, which was hot milk and some type of a snack, either paratha, kachori, muri, something like that, and sandesh. And we would keep some sandesh in a little bowl for Prabhupada so that when he was translating, he would be able to snack on the sandesh. So he would sleep from 11 to 1, wake up at 1 o'clock, dictate all night, and then come down to his main room, chant his Gayatri, and look out of his 3 windows to see who was coming to Mangalartik. And if he saw you were coming late, you would get called in. I got called in one day. That's how I know. And that's why I will never, ever be late for Mangalartik in my whole life. You just have to get chastised one time by Prabhupada. Never again. You don't want to have that happen. Someone had locked the gate. I had to climb over the wall. And he saw me running in. So after Mangalartik, Brahmananda comes and says, Prabhupada wants to see you. Then you know you're in trouble when Prabhupada calls you. So never be late for Mangalartik, because Prabhupada is watching you there through his 3 windows. And then after Mangalartik, Prabhupada would come out of his room. He would go on his morning walk. We would all run in, clean the whole house. Prabhupada would come back exactly on time for greeting the deities, Guru Puja, and then class. That was exact. You didn't need the clock, because Prabhupada was our clock. We knew exactly what time it was according to what Prabhupada was doing during the day. Exactly, because he never changed his schedule. So, why did Prabhupada come to San Francisco? Because Mukunda and Sam and Roger and the other devotees who had been collected by Mukunda, they had an idea. They were going to have a mantra rock dance. And they had rented a hall big enough for 3,000 people. And all of the performers were rock musicians. But they were going to have Prabhupada chant Hare Krishna for 3,000 people. That was the maximum thing. Now, they wrote to Prabhupada, told him January 29th is the day of the mantra rock dance. We're sending you the ticket, 17th, so you have a little time to prepare yourself. Prabhupada arrived, and these lines here, that's all light show, because part of the experience of these heavy rock bands is light shows, light and sound. They would put light it would be huge, 100 feet by 180 feet, with 3,000 people crushed into there, and a big stage like here. So on this stage, normally it would be the rock singers, but on this stage you have Srila Prabhupada in the center, and you have Allen Ginsberg next to him, and you have the devotees, and you have all of the musical equipment in the background because the rock stars are going, they sang before Prabhupada, and they're going to sing after Prabhupada. And then you had the high priests of the hippies. Now, who were they? Mukunda had arranged with the owner of the Avalon Ballroom that his name was Chet Helms. Now, Chet Helms, he would always, this was a regular thing for him. He would always have the big rock bands come in and do their music shows. This is the first time he was having a Swami come in. And they decided to do it on a Sunday because Friday night, Saturday night, that was when everybody comes to enjoy. So they got Sunday night. And Chet thought that that wasn't going to, who comes on a Sunday night? You have to, Monday, some people do work, like that. So this rock dance was scheduled on Sunday evening, January 29th, 1967. A day of the week deemed odd and unlikely to generate substantial attendance. Admission was fixed at $2.50 and limited to door sales. That means you had to stand in line, buy your ticket, pay right there, then you can get in. By the beginning of the concert at 8 p.m., an audience of nearly 3,000 had gathered at the Avalon Ballroom, filling the hall to its capacity. Latecomers had to wait outside for vacancies in order to enter. Now, once the people went in, they weren't going to come out. So there were lines all around the block to get in. Plus, there were people waiting outside for when they could get in. Participants were treated with prasad consisting of orange slices. They cut up thousands of slices of oranges, mosambi, and passed that out to the hippies. And many in the crowd were smoking marijuana, that's ganja, and taking other intoxicants, specifically LSD, which is acid. We've heard all about acid. However, the atmosphere in the hall was peaceful. Strobe lights and a psychedelic liquid light show, along with pictures of Krishna and the Hare Krishna mantra, were projected onto the walls. So you had the musicians on the stage, and at the back of the hall, in a room upstairs, you had the light people. And the light people, they were flashing pictures of Krishna, the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra, all kinds of oils of different colors and flashing lights all over the place. That was part of the experience of these rock bands, these rock things. Though some of the New York disciples had objected, Srila Prabhupada was still scheduled for the mantra rock dance at the Avalon Ballroom. It wasn't proper, they had said, for the devotees out in San Francisco to ask their spiritual master to go to such a place. It would mean amplified guitars, pounding drums, wild light shows, and hundreds of drugged hippies. How could his pure message be heard in such a place? Well, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. And here's how Prabhupada, this is how Prabhupada saw everything. What followed was amazing. Cued by the words flashed on the wall, that's the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra, the crowd quickly picked up the chant. Band members ran onto the stage with instruments. One guy had then all the different instruments. We were pounding out the Hare Krishna mantra in sound that rocked the rafters. Suddenly, Swamiji stood and threw up his arms and started dancing. First time we're seeing the Swami two-step. It's the Swami step. One leg crosses in front, down, then the other, down, sway back and forth to the music. and the crowd goes wild. Everyone's dancing and spinning as strobe lights erupt in ecstasy. We're seeing yet another dazzling side to the Swami, the showman, hippest of the hip, at home in this bizarre celebration. He loved it. All of our icons on one stage, and Swamiji is the star. He's on a roll, mesmerizing everyone. I was to see this many times more in the future, gazing with wonder as the Swami takes over the show for another perfect performance. So Srila Prabhupada didn't care who the audience was. He was on a mission, and he was going to get the whole world to chant Hare Krishna. Even these drug-induced crazy hippies, he got them all to dance and chant along with him. But in San Francisco, Mukunda and the others had been working on the mantra rock dance for months. It would draw thousands of young people, and the San Francisco Radha Krishna temple stood to make thousands of dollars. So you do a little mathematics. $2.50 times 3,000. How much is that? $7,500. So they had to pay each of the music groups $250. There were about 5 groups. They had to pay for security, and they had to pay for the ballroom. They made $2,000 in that one night. So although among his New York disciples, Srila Prabhupada had expressed uncertainty, he now said nothing to deter the enthusiasm of his San Francisco followers, because Prabhupada had transcendental vision. Why would he not want to get 3,000 people to chant Hare Krishna? And they paid for it. Sam Spirsta, that's Sharmasundar, whose book we just read from, Mukunda's friend and one of the mantra rock organizers, explained the idea to Hayagriva, who had just arrived from New York. So although Prabhupada went with just one new devotee named Ranchor, later Hayagriva came, Ravindra Sarup came, Kirtanananda came, Haridas was already there, Mukunda was already there, Janaki was already there. There's a whole new school of San Francisco music opening up. The Grateful Dead have already cut their first record. They're offered to do this dance as a great publicity boost, just when we need it. But Swamiji says that even Ravi Shankar is Maya, Hayagriva said. So Ravi Shankar, he was the most popular classical Indian musician, sitarist at the time. If you're not chanting for Krishna's pleasure, then it's Maya, right? So they were being more conservative than Srila Prabhupada was. Srila Prabhupada was ready to chant at the mantra rock dance, but the New York devotees thought that it wasn't proper. Now, these on that picture here, so the people coming in, there were some big high priests. The high priests were Timothy Leary and Stanley Owsley. Now, Timothy Leary, he used to be a Harvard psychology professor. And he used to experiment with different chemicals to help psychiatric conditions. And he came up with synthetic chemicals that were the same as in magic mushrooms, mushrooms that create a mystical experience. So he created what's called LSD. It's a particular type of acid. And he was giving that to prisoners and to volunteer students and to students in theological seminaries to see what the psychological effects. This is part of a Harvard study. But he went overboard and he started using it for more than just clinical studies. So he was removed from Harvard. So he, along with another person named Stanley Owsley, he was, amongst many other things, he was a sound engineer, but he was also a chemist. He figured out how to make LSD, acid. And he made up to 500 million doses that he distributed to the hippies all over the world. So these were called the high priests of the hippies, people like that. So they came to this program, and because of their fame, they were allowed to sit on the stage with Srila Prabhupada. Mukunda mentions in his book, Miracle on 2nd Avenue, because he was selling the tickets at the front. When Timothy Leary, who had been the Harvard professor, came to buy a ticket, he was completely drunk from alcohol. And he was with a 14-year-old girl. He was a college professor. And Mukunda wasn't going to let him in because he was completely intoxicated. But the devotee said, no, that's Timothy Leary, you have to let him in. And then he went up on the stage. And then Stanley Owsley came, and he just looked like an ordinary person because he was an engineer and a chemist. And the devotee said, no, you have to let him in too. So these people, they were leaders amongst the hippies, but whether they were like, for instance, Mr. Owsley, he created the acid, he made the acid, but he believed in 100% meat diet. He only ate meat because he was of the opinion that humans were carnivores and the only thing that they should eat is meat. And Timothy Leary, he had 5 wives and who knows how many. So these were not moral leaders. They were not ethical or religious leaders. They were actually misleading people. So, and many, many times they were put into jail for their misdemeanors. And the President of the United States, he said that Timothy Leary was the most dangerous person in the world because he was misguiding the youth by getting them to take intoxication. So there were 2 sides. They were called the high priests of the hippies, and on the other side they were criminals and the most dangerous people in the world. It depended what your viewpoint was. Okay, so now we come to the Grateful Dead. The Grateful Dead, they were a famous rock band like the Beatles. Everyone's heard of the Beatles. So actually the Beatles were not allowed into America because America at that time was strongly Christian. And when the Beatles were having their great popularity in Europe and in UK, they proclaimed themselves to be more famous than Jesus Christ. So when the clergymen heard that they felt that the Beatles had offended Jesus Christ, they asked that the US government not allow them to come into America. So they were never allowed as a group into America, although George Harrison later was allowed to come in. So now we had in America other big rock bands. And one of the biggest was the Grateful Dead. And the Grateful Dead, they were very sympathetic. They liked the devotees a lot. When Sam and Melanie, or Shamsundar and Malati, got married, they sent all of the flowers for the wedding to decorate the temple. And actually when the Grateful Dead used to do their rock shows, because we preached on the East Coast and this was the West Coast, when the Grateful Dead came to the East Coast, we would travel with them and cook for them and bring into their, behind the stage, full plates of prasadam for all of the band members. And when they were doing their shows, before they started, they would make an announcement that tonight the Hare Krishnas are here and they're passing out some really good spiritual food. So you all have some of the spiritual food and you chant Hare Krishna. So they were very, very helpful in spreading Krishna consciousness in America, just like the Beatles were all around the world. So the Grateful Dead, they agreed to perform at this, and they were the most popular at that time. Oh, it's all been arranged, Sam assured him. He was talking to Hayagriva. All the bands will be on stage, and Allen Ginsberg will introduce Swamiji to San Francisco. Swamiji will talk and then chant Hare Krishna, with the bands joining in. Then he leaves. So they were having just Prabhupada come in, sit on the stage, chant, and then leave, so he wouldn't have to be subjected to all of that loud music. There should be around 4,000 people there. Srila Prabhupada knew he would not compromise himself. He would go, chant, and then leave. The important thing was to spread the chanting of Hare Krishna. If this is a picture of Hippie Hill in Golden Gate Park. And the girl standing in the center there, that's our god sister. Her name is Nandarani. She lived here in Vrindavan for many years. When you go to the Goshala, all of the roads that you see that we have in the Goshala, it was she who designed all of those roads. She used to live there, and she was a nurse at our Gurukula. She did a lot of wonderful service for Srila Prabhupada. She and her husband were also in charge of the Gurukula in Dallas, Texas. So when the Gurukula was brought here, they also came to Vrindavan, and she lived there. So this is before she became, she has her beads, but before she became in sari and everything, hair back, all that. Okay. If thousands of young people gathered to hear rock music could be engaged in hearing and chanting the names of God, then what was the harm? As a preacher, Prabhupada was prepared to go anywhere to spread Krishna consciousness. Since chanting Hare Krishna was absolute, one who heard or chanted the names of Krishna, anyone, anywhere, in any condition, could be saved from falling to the lower species in next life. So these people were already practically living like animals. And Prabhupada was so merciful. I put a circle here. That's the back of Prabhupada's head. See that? That's Prabhupada chanting with all of the hippies there on Hippie Hill joining in with him. This is Chet Helm, who owned the Avalon Ballroom, who gave permission for the devotees to have the big mantra rock dance. These young hippies wanted something spiritual, but they had no direction. They were confused, accepting hallucinations as spiritual visions. But they were seeking genuine spiritual life, just like many of the young people on the Lower East Side. Prabhupada decided he would go. His disciples wanted him to, and he was their servant and the servant of Lord Chaitanya. Mukunda, Sam, and Harvey Cohen had already met with rock entrepreneur Chet Helms, that's him, who had agreed that they could use his Avalon Ballroom, and that if they could get the bands to come, everything above the cost of the groups, the security, and a few other basics would go as profit for the San Francisco Radha Krishna Temple. These are some of the rock members, the band members. On the left is the Grateful Dead, and on the right is a group called Moby Grape. Mukunda and Sam had then gone calling on the musical groups, most of whom lived in the Bay Area. And one after another, the exciting new San Francisco rock bands, the Grateful Dead, Moby Grape, had agreed to appear with Swami Bhaktivedanta for the minimum wage of $250 per group. And Allen Ginsberg had agreed. The lineup was complete. In San Francisco, every rock concert had an art poster, many of them designed by the psychedelic artist called Mouse. One thing about Mouse's posters was that it was difficult to tell where the letters left off and the background began. He used dissonant colors that were very striking. It was very hard to read the posters, that made his posters seem to flash on and off. Borrowing from this tradition, Harvey Cohen had created a unique poster. You remember Harvey was an artist. He was the one who painted the first Panchatattva painting that Prabhupada used in the 26th 2nd Avenue. So Harvey created this poster. Krishna consciousness comes west, using red and blue concentric circles and a candid photo of Swamiji smiling in Tompkins Square Park. The devotees put the posters up all over town. So here we have the advertisement. Krishna consciousness comes west. First, Swami Bhaktivedanta, Allen Ginsberg, the Grateful Dead, Moby Grape, Big Brother and the Holding Company. That was another famous rock group. Mantra Rock Dance, Sunday, January 29th, 8 p.m. And then it tells how much it's going to cost. And you bring your pillows, bring your musical instruments, and who the light show was going to be run by, because these light shows were very much a part of the whole atmosphere. Hayagriva had not yet shaved his beard off and his hair. Hayagriva and Mukunda went to discuss the program for the Mantra Rock Dance with Allen Ginsberg. Mukunda is standing above, and Hayagriva, and next to him is Roger, who became Guru Das. Guru Das married Jamuna, who was, that was Janaki's sister, and Guru Das was our first temple president here at the Krishna Balaram Temple. Allen was already well known as an advocate of the Hare Krishna mantra. In fact, acquaintances would often greet him with Hare Krishna when he walked on Haight Street. And he was known to visit and recommend that others visit the Radha Krishna temple. Hayagriva, whose full beard and long hair rivaled Allen's, was concerned about the melody Allen would use when he chanted with Swamiji. "I think the melody you use," Hayagriva said, "is too difficult for good chanting." It wasn't the same as Prabhupada's melody. "Maybe," Allen admitted, "but that's the melody I first heard in India. A wonderful lady saint was chanting it." That was in Calcutta. He heard the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra. "I'm quite accustomed to it, and it's the only one I can sing convincingly." With only a few days remaining before the Mantra Rock Dance, Allen came to an early morning kirtan at the temple and later joined Swami Prabhupada upstairs in his room. A few devotees were sitting with Prabhupada eating Indian sweets when Alan came to the door. He and Prabhupada smiled and exchanged greetings, and Prabhupada offered him a sweet, remarking that Mr. Ginsburg was up very early. He probably hadn't gone to sleep that night. Yes, Alan replied. The phone hasn't stopped ringing since I arrived in San Francisco. Now this is Allen Ginsberg. Here we are again at Hippie Hill. This is when he was leading the chanting of Hare Krishna to 20,000 hippies on Hippie Hill. Now Prabhupada says, this is what happens when one becomes famous, said Prabhupada. That was the tragedy of Mahatma Gandhi also. Wherever he went, thousands of people would crowd around him, chanting, Mahatma Gandhi ki jai, Mahatma Gandhi ki jai. The gentleman could not sleep. Well, at least it got me up for kirtan this morning, said Alan. Yes, that is good. All right, we'll continue next week. It's after 7 o'clock. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Jai.